Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one, we're taking a look at the first newly releasing card of the season in Jean Grey. Jean Grey is a 3-cost, 3-power with the ability Ongoing. Players must play their first card here each turn if possible. So personally, I think this looks like the strongest card of the month in terms of just raw power. This is a very powerful effect, especially if you can design your deck in a way where you can make the most use of it and it's frustrating for your opponent. Now, whether or not this card will be good, I think is going to depend on the larger context of the metagame. We're expecting a patch tomorrow that hopefully is going to bring some balance changes, but I think the big thing here is if Bounce is still as popular and still as powerful as it is right now, I think it's going to be really hard for Jean to be good, because Bounce is kind of much like, it was kind of like this with Nebula too, where Nebula was a very powerful card and still is, but with Kitty Pryde existing, it ends up being just not as spectacular because the fact that these bounce decks are making more people run Killmonger, which is obviously bad for it. But the bigger thing is you just get around the effect. You can just play Kitty every turn, and then you don't have to worry about the Nebula effect. And the same thing applies to Jean Grey, where you just play your Kitty like you want to in the Jean Grey lane, and then you're free to play cards elsewhere. So given that Bounce is like probably the best deck in the game right now, I do think that even though this card is strong, I don't know if it is going to be good enough in the context of the current meta. Now that could change. We don't really know what changes, if any, are coming tomorrow. So maybe they do hit Bounce. Maybe they hit High Evo. I don't know. But whatever they do end up hitting is going to have a pretty big impact on how useful Jean is. But mainly Bounce is the big concern. Other than that, I do think the card is powerful and interesting to build around. I do think it will have a place in the metagame if Bounce is no longer the best deck. So we'll have to wait and see on that front. Nothing else, it is a interesting card to try out in Surfer, and it's definitely going to add some utility to Jeff as being able to fill up the Jean Grey lane so you don't have to play into her effect. It seems really good, and then you can always just move Jeff out if you do want to play into that lane. So kind of a buff for Jeff in my opinion. Also going to be good with Brood because you can Jean into Brood and then pump them all with the Surfer. So I think it's an alright card. I don't think you should spend your tokens on it. You can, if you have boxes saved up, you might be able to get it out of the new system when that releases tomorrow. But even though it's a good card, I don't think I would recommend spending 6k tokens on it when we don't really know how things are going to change with the update tomorrow in terms of balancing. So I would exercise some precaution here, just kind of wait, see how things play out, give it at least a day before you commit your tokens, or just wait and see how it's going and decide if you want to open those reserves to try and get her with the release of the new system. So those are my thoughts on Jean. Let's take a look at the decks. All right, so moving on to the decks, we're going to start off with just an iteration on the best deck in the game, and that is Bounce. So as previously mentioned, Bounce really doesn't have a hard time dealing with the Jean restriction, especially if we have Kitty Pryde, but we also have other cheap things we can play down, play stuff in another lane. Jeff lets us avoid the restriction as well. It's just not really impacted very heavily by this card and can be really annoying to your opponent's game plan if they are not running a deck with a bunch of cheap stuff, which I think most decks outside of Bounce really aren't running. So I think Jean will actually be pretty decent in Bounce as a tech versus the other decks in the format. However, if Bounce still stays as good as it is now, you might be better off with some different tech choices. Nonetheless, I do think it is an interesting idea, and why not put just the new good card in the old best deck and just call it a day? Probably will work pretty well. Then we have a list I'm a little bit more excited for, and that is the Surfer Control list. So pretty interesting one here. The idea is we are just a Silver Surfer lane control style deck. I believe it was Quinny Equinox who started putting Spider-Man in for the Sarah spot, and I think that makes a lot of sense, as right now with all these decks going around trying to counter Bounce, Sometimes Sarah gets caught in the crossfire and it can be awkward to play her, so just having Spider-Man as our lone 5-drop to hopefully shut down a lane I think makes a lot of sense. We also have Storm Juggernaut for closing down a lane. We can follow up the Storm with our Brood too if we want, which is good with Surfer. Jean can make things really awkward for the opponent, forcing them to play into a lane that we've already committed a lot of stuff to, or forcing them to play into a Cosmo lane if they don't want to. So this deck is really all about the restrictions. It's also why we're running Goose, because it shuts down the opponent's ability to play big stuff in that lane. So with all the different lane denial, I think seems pretty solid. We're running Invisible Woman as one of our 2-drops, mainly for Killmonger. It is pretty much impossible to throw priority versus bounce, so this gives us a way to deal with their 1-drops with a hidden Killmonger, which is nice. Also has an added effect of being good with Maximus, where if we don't get our Cosmo, we can hide Maximus behind Invisible Woman so the opponent does not benefit from the card draw. Jeff, just another good 2-drop here, very good with the lane locking theme. Overall, I think this would be a lot of fun to play. I missed playing Surfer. I actually played a little bit of it on my Climb to Infinite this month with a Patriot list, and I think this one will utilize Jean Grey pretty effectively. Then we have Thanos Lockdown. So Thanos Lockdown was one of my favorite decks during the Guardians of the Galaxy season. I had a lot of fun with it, really enjoyed playing it, stopped playing it quite as much due to some other versions of Lockdown becoming good as well, but I've played this deck recently and it actually still does pretty well. You do have to be a little mindful of Killmonger though, which is why we ended up adding in armor. But I think this is a very fun Lockdown deck, and Jean Grey adds quite a bit to it, makes our Guardians a little bit more consistent with Drax and Gamora. And of course, we have all 3 main Lockdown cards in Spider-Man, Professor X, and Storm. If you don't have access to Jeff, you could also consider Daredevil in this list to help guarantee your Lockdown card on 5 is going to be as effective as possible. But other than that, really like the list. I think it's good at what it does. You just have to be a little mindful of Killmonger with your Thanos stones, but the card quality here is high enough to where even a rogue Killmonger might not be enough to stop us with what we're trying to do with the Elaine Lock shenanigans. And the last deck we have to round it out here is a kind of old school deck, which is Ongoing Destroyer. So I don't know if this is actually going to be good enough, but I sure want to try it, as Ongoing Destroyer was the first deck I used to hit Infinite with in the first season of the game. We're running pretty classic list. The only change I've made here is putting in Orca over Spectrum. I think that's kind of personal preference. Obviously, Spectrum can be good in this list as we are running like all ongoing cards, so it's a lot of power. I like the surprise factor of Orca, especially if we don't get down our armor or Cosmo for Destroyer. We can just fill up a lane with Jean, make it so we have the most power in that lane, then just slam Orca in another lane to close it out is the idea. We also have Professor X, which I think can be pretty good if we are filling up our lane effectively. Force the opponent to play a card into the Jean lane when we're already full up on it, and then we can just slam Professor X in an unoccupied lane. So I think this will be an interesting one to try and see if it is able to keep up with the higher power of some of the more recently new decks that we've gotten since this deck was a thing way back at the release of the game. You could definitely try Spectrum in the Orca slot, definitely personal preference there. I hope this will be enough to be decent, but only time will tell, as I don't know if anyone has played this deck in quite some time, but should be fun to revisit nonetheless. And lore win bonus too, getting to run Jean Grey with Professor X. There we have it. Those are day 1 decks for Jean Grey. As always, link in the description to the decks if you want to import them into the game. Also be covering some decks for Marvel Snap Zone, so keep an eye out for those if you want even more decks, courtesy of the Brewmaster himself, Safety Blade. So keep an eye out for that. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. Let me know what you think about Jean in the comments below. Are you picking her up? Are you going to wait for the cash system? Are you not really interested in her effect? Let me know in the comments below. That's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.